Number 10, we have the passage and quote on I forbid, I order. It says, "Leave me as I leave you. For the people who were before you were ruined because of their questions and their differences over the prophets. So if I forbid you to do something, then keep away from it. And if I order you to do something, then do it as much as you can." And that's taken from Sahih al-Bukhari 7288. Number 9, don't wish to be like anyone. And this quote goes, "Do not wish to be like anyone except in 2 cases. First is a person whom Allah has given wealth and he spends it righteously. The second is the one whom Allah has given wisdom, the Holy Quran, and he acts according to it and teaches it to others." And that's found in Sahih Bukhari 73. Now next up, the quote at number 8 has to do with defending believers. And this goes as follows. "All pious believers shall deem it their bounden duty to defend believers and to aid them wheresoever they may be, whether far or near, and throughout Christendom shall protect the place where they conduct worship and those where their monks and priests dwell." And that quote is actually taken from the covenant with the Christians of Persia that Prophet Muhammad had made. At number 7 has to do with strong believers. So the strong believer is better and more beloved to Allah than the weak believer. Although there is good in each, desire that which will bring you benefit, and seek help from Allah, and do not give way to incapacity. If something happens to you, do not say, "If only I had done such and such." Rather say, "The decree of Allah. He does what He will. Otherwise, you will open yourself up to the action of shaitan." And that's found in Sahih Muslim 2664. Alright, number 6 is an interesting passage about praying and being kind and striving for the cause of Allah. This one goes as follows. Once the Prophet Muhammad was asked, "Tell us what action is dearest to Allah." He answered, "To say your prayer at its proper time." Again he was asked, "What comes next?" Muhammad said, "To show kindness to parents." Then what? He was asked, "To strive for the cause of Allah." And that's taken from Ibn Masad Bukhari. Halfway now at number 5, let's take a look at it being better to sit alone. Really? Okay. So this is how the quote goes. "It is better to sit alone than in company with the bad. And it is better still to sit with the good than alone. It is better to speak to a seeker of knowledge than to remain silent, but silence is better than idle words." And that's taken from Bukhari. Yeah, whole lot of saying and information packed into that one. Now moving on to the quote at number 4, "Allah puts you to the test." Now this is a very, very popular one. "Whoever Allah wants good for him, He puts them to test. He puts them through difficulties like a diamond or gold that has to be burnt, after which anything bad from it is removed, so that what you have is pure diamond or the pure gold." And that's found in Bukhari and Muslim. From there we look at the quote at number 3, "Time moves fast in the end." And I thought this was a pretty fascinating one. So check this out. "The hour will not be established until time passes rapidly, such that a year is like a month is like a week is like a day is like an hour is like a flicker of a flame." And that quote is found in Sunan al-Tirmidhi 2332. Okay, so the quote at number 2 has to do with protecting Christians everywhere. "Everywhere, in mountains or in the plains, in towns and in waste places, in deserts, and wheresoever they may be, that people shall be protected, both in their faith and their property, both in the west and the east, both on sea and land." And that's also taken from the covenant of the Christians that the Prophet Muhammad made to the Christians in Persia. Now we end off this episode with a very, very popular one. It's about the 2 treasures. And now this quote has been mentioned by Muslims quite often actually. And many non-Muslims are also familiar with this quote as well. But it goes as follows. "I, Muhammad, left among you 2 treasures, which if you cling to them, you shall not be led into error after me. One of them is greater than the other, the Book of God, the Quran, which is a rope stretched from heaven to earth. And the second one is my progeny, my Al-Bayt. These 2 shall not be parted until they return to the pool of abundance in paradise. And that is taken from the Hadith al-Thaqalain. Starting at number 10, hope prevails. Once the Prophet Muhammad, when he went to a young man who was on his deathbed, and he asked him, "How do you feel?" And the young man said, "I have much hope from Allah, but I also fear for my sins." Then the Prophet Muhammad said, "The believer who has these two ideas simultaneously at such time, Allah fulfills his hopes and grants him security from fear." And that's found in Tirmidhi. Now the saying at number 9 involves bearing good news. This quote says, "Give glad tidings and do not scare people away. Make things easy and do not make things difficult." And this is narrated by Abu Dawood. Number 8, optimism is an act of worship. So the following found in Tirmidhi and Hakim says, hoping for good is also an act of worship of Allah. Also, there is no infection and there are no omens, but I like optimism. Optimism is a good word. Number 7 brings us to no excuses. The following goes, and I quote, "The strong believer is better and more beloved to Allah than the weak believer, although there is good in each. Desire that which will bring you benefit and seek help from Allah and do not give way to incapacity. If something happens to you, do not say, 'If only I had done such and such.' Rather say, 'The decree of Allah, He does what He wills.' Otherwise, you'll open yourself up to the action of shaitan." And that's found in the Hadith Muslim. All right, moving on to the saying at number 6, do good no matter what. This passage goes as follows. "Do not be people without minds of your own, saying that if others treat you well, you'll treat them well, and that if they do wrong, you will do wrong. But instead, accustom yourself to do good if people do good, and not to do wrong if people do evil." And that's found in the Tirmidhi Hadith. Halfway in at number 5, be positive in difficulty. This hadith goes like this. "Whoever abstains from asking others, Allah will make him contented. And whoever tries to make himself self-sufficient, Allah will make him self-sufficient. And whoever remains patient, Allah will make him patient. Nobody can be given a blessing better and greater than patience." And that's taken from the Bukhari hadith. Moving on now to number 4, think positively about God. Allah the Most High said, "I am as my servant thinks or expects I am. I am with him when he mentions me. If he mentions me to himself, I mention him to myself. And if he mentions me in an assembly, I mention him in an assembly greater than it. If he draws near to me a hand's length, I draw near to him an arm's length. And if he comes to me walking, I go to him at speed." And that's taken from the Hadith Qudsi. Next up on this list, number 3, asking for forgiveness helps. Whoever does a lot of istighfar, which is asking for forgiveness, Allah will provide him a way out of each concern he has. He will solve all his troubles and will provide him with livelihood from sources that were not known to him. That passage was quoted from the Hadith Ahmad. Moving on now to number 2, positive outcomes are expected for the believers. And now this passage goes like this. "Wondrous is the affair of the believer, for there is good for him in every matter, and this is not the case with anyone except the believer. If he is happy, then he thanks Allah, and thus there is good for him. If he is harmed, then he shows patience, and thus there is good for him." And that's taken from the Muslim Hadith. And now we end off this episode with number 1, remain positive till the end. "If the day of resurrection were established upon one of you, while he has in his hands a sapling, which is a small plant, then let him plant it." And that's taken from the Ahmad Hadith. Alright guys, so that brings us to the end of another episode just like that. These sayings and quotes of the Prophet Muhammad really inspire a lot of hope and faith and belief and optimism in people. So if you found this video useful and beneficial, don't forget to leave a like and also share it. And I'm also curious to know your thoughts and comments. Leave them down below. So that's it for me in this episode. Thanks for coming back and hanging out. Until next time guys, stay awesome, stay educated, and I'll see you real soon. The covenant at number 10 involves monks and pilgrims, and it goes as follows. If a monk or pilgrim seeks protection in mountain or valley, in a cave or in tilled fields, in the plain, in the desert, or in a church, I am behind them, defending them from every enemy. I, my helpers, all the members of my religion, and my followers, for they, the monks and the pilgrims, are my proteges and my subjects. And that is a covenant with monks of Sinai. Number 9 brings us a covenant about Christian women. If a Christian woman enters a Muslim household, she shall be received with kindness, and she shall be given the opportunity to pray in her church. There shall be no dispute between her and a man who loves her religion. Whoever contravenes the covenant of Allah and acts to the contrary is a rebel against his covenant and his messenger. And this is also taken from the covenant with monks of Mount Sinai. Moving on to number 8, let's look at one about pious believers. All pious believers shall deem it their bounden duty to defend believers and to aid them wheresoever they may be, whether far or near, and throughout Christendom shall protect the places where they conduct worship, and those where their monks and priests dwell, everywhere, in mountains or in the plains, in the towns and in the waste places, in deserts, and wheresoever they may be, that people shall be protected, both in their faith and in their property, both in the west and in the east, both on the sea and on land. And that's a covenant with the Christians of Persia. So it got pretty specific in that one. Now, moving on to number 7, forced to confess Islam. This one goes as follows. No Christian shall be brought by force to confess Islam, and no disputes except over the better things shall be envisaged in with them. Muslims shall extend over the Christians everywhere the arm of mercy and kindness, protecting them from the exactions of oppressors. Now, this was a covenant with the Christians of Persia also. Now, moving on to number 6, Christians have actually helped, and this one speaks about it. So it says that the Christians respected my alliance, they recognized my rights, they fulfilled the promises that they had made during our meeting, they assisted the lieutenants that I had sent to the frontiers, they earned my concern and my affection by fulfilling the obligations that I had contracted with them. And that's from the covenant with the Christians of Najran. Also, another covenant with the Christians of Najran goes as follows. Do not neglect the Christians. This says, the Muslims must not abandon the Christians, neglect them, and leave them without help and assistance, since I have made this pact with them on behalf of Allah to ensure that whatever good befell Muslims, it would befall them as well, and whatever harm befell Muslims would befall them also. Next up, the covenant of number 4 really speaks about the support for Christians. If the Christians seek the help and assistance of the Muslims in order to repair their churches and their covenants, or to arrange matters pertaining to their affairs and religion, they, the Muslims, must help and support them. And this one was of the covenant with the Christians of the entire world. Also, there's a covenant about the rights of Christians. Christians have obtained enviable rights to enjoy our protection, to be protected from any infringement on their rights, so that they will be bound to the Muslims both in good and bad fortune. Number 2 speaks about honor. If there be among Christians a great and learned man, the Mohammedans, I guess that's another word for Muslims back in the day, shall honor him and not be envious of his greatness. And this was the covenant with the Assyrian Christians. And finally, we end off with number 1, guilty of disobedience. And this one goes as follows. If anyone is unjust and unkind to the Christians, he will be guilty of disobeying the prophet of God. And that's also from the covenant with the Assyrian Christians. And number 10, we have Surah 2 verses 191. Now, this has a false interpretation, and that is slay the unbeliever wherever you find them. Now, you see, reading the verses before and after actually gives some context, and that's not necessarily what the verse actually says. Either way, when we look at Surah 2 verses 190, it says, "Fight in the way of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress. Indeed, Allah does not like transgressors." And then moving on to Surah 2 verses 191, it actually says, "And kill them wherever you overtake them, and expel them from wherever they have expelled you. And fitna is worse than killing. And do not fight them at al-Masjid al-Haram until they fight you there. But if they fight you, then kill them. Such is the recompense of the disbelievers." And then moving on to Surah 2 verses 192, the next verse, it says, "And if they cease, then indeed Allah is forgiving and merciful." So those scriptures there just really give some context of the actual text. Now moving on to number 9, Surah 3 verses 28. Here's the false interpretation of this one. Muslims must not take infidels as friends. And by the way, infidels are unbelievers. Now, the Quran doesn't forbid Muslims from becoming friends with non-Muslims, but during wartime, it says that they should not join with the enemy. When we look in the Quran, we find this: "Let not believers take disbelievers as allies rather than believers. And whoever of you does that has nothing with Allah except when taking precaution against them in prudence. And Allah warns you of himself, and to Allah is the final destination." And that's the full verse of Surah 3 verses 28. Next up, let's look at Surah 3 verses 85. Here is the false interpretation for this one. "Any religion other than Islam is not acceptable. Therefore, Islam is not tolerant of any other religious group." Here's the thing, all religions usually say that their religion is the most correct or the most beneficial, so there's not necessarily anything wrong in and of itself with Islam making that same claim. However, in the Quran, you will find certain verses that actually esteem prophets in Judaism and in Christianity. So this does point to one aspect that Islam is tolerant in. Now, the Quran says this: "Say, we have believed in Allah and in what was revealed to us and what was revealed to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the descendants, and in what was given to Moses and Jesus and to the prophets from their Lord. We make no distinction between any of them, and we are Muslims submitting to him." That is Surah 3 verses 84. The Quran also says this in Surah 2 verses 256, "There shall be no compulsion in acceptance of the religion." The next misunderstood verse is Surah 8 verse 12. It goes as follows: "Remember thy Lord inspired the angels with the message. I am with you. Give firmness to the believers. I will instill terror into the hearts of the unbelievers. Smite ye above their necks and smite all their fingertips off." And now for context, this was a verse that was revealed around the time of the Battle of Badr. The pagans of Mecca, they traveled more than 200 miles to Medina with an army of over 1,000 men to kill Muslims who numbered around 300. By this verse, though, Muslims are ordered to fight to defend themselves. Another verse in the same chapter, Surah 86 verses 61, says this: "But if the enemy incline towards peace, you also incline towards peace, and trust in God, for he is one that hears and knows all things." And that is a proper context of that verse. The next misunderstood verse we're going to look at is Surah 9 verses 123, and this is how it goes: "O you who believe, fight those of the unbelievers who are near, and let them find in you hardness, and know that Allah is with those who guard against evil." Now, this verse, according to Muslim sources, is speaking about the hypocrites who were among the Muslims in the time of the Prophet. The unbelievers who are near you were in actuality non-Muslims posing as Muslims who sought to corrupt the believing Muslims from within, destroying them from the inside out. Now, this instruction was to fight them, and fight in this context is to resist the skepticism of these hypocrites. The next two verses actually point out that this is actually about hypocrites. And whenever a new chapter is revealed, some of the hypocrites ask the believers in jest, whose faith has increased because of this. As for those who believe, it will certainly increase their faith, and they are joyful over that. And that was taken from Surah 9 verses 124. Now halfway in at number 5, we have Surah 48 verses 29. And it goes as follows: Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and those who are with him are severe against disbelievers and merciful among themselves. Now the disbelievers in this verse refers to those who persecuted and attacked the Muslims. This is not a verse directing Muslims to just go out and mistreat other non-Muslims. Moving on to number 4, here we look at Surah 98 verses 6. Now this is the false interpretation. Anyone who doesn't call themselves Muslim is going to hell. But you see, the actual verse goes like this: Verily, those who disbelieve from among the people of the scripture and al-mushrikun will abide in the fire of hell. They are the worst of creatures. Now, according to Islam, Muslims, they're not allowed to say that any one person is going to go to hell just because they call themselves a Christian, a Jew, or they have a different religious label or no religious label. Each person's destination when it comes to the hereafter is only known by God. Now, moving on to number 3, here we have Surah 5 verses 101 to 102. Now, here is the false interpretation of this one. Do not question Islam. Well, the full verse reads like this: O ye who believed, ask not questions about things which, if made plain to you, may cause you trouble. But if you ask about things when the Quran is being revealed, they will be made plain to you. Allah will forgive those, for Allah is oft forgiving, most forbearing. Some people before you did ask such questions, and on that account lost their faith. Now, this is in reference to those people who ask useless questions about when a revelation is revealed from the Quran. And here's the thing, if all their questions were answered, well, it would have made the duties of their faith and practicing their religion a lot more specific, and therefore making it a lot more difficult to perform. Moving on to number 2, here we have Surah 8 verses 65, and this is a false interpretation. The unbelievers are stupid. Urge the Muslims to fight them. Now the correct reading of that verse is this: O Prophet, urge the believers to battle. If there are among you 20 who are steadfast, they will overcome 200. And if there are among you 100 who are steadfast, they will overcome 1,000 of those who have disbelieved, because they are people who do not understand. Now, Islam teaches that this verse was revealed to motivate the Muslim army, which was less in number than the opposition in the Battle of Badr. Now, we end this episode off with the most misunderstood verse of the Quran in this episode, and that is Surah 22 verses 19. Here is the false interpretation first. Punish the unbelievers with garments of fire, boiling water, melt their skin. But this is not describing an Islamic punishment to be administered, but rather it's a punishment that happens in hell. Here is the more correct translation of the verse, along with verses that say that this is the punishment in hell. When we look at Surah 22 verses 19, it says, these are two adversaries who have disputed over their Lord. But those who disbelieve will have cut out for them garments of fire. Poured upon their heads will be scalding water. Now, Surah 22 verses 22, it says, every time they want to get out of hellfire from anguish, they will be returned to it, and it will be said, taste the punishment of the burning fire. And then we have the following verse that contrasts what those who are granted paradise will experience. And just notice the similarity when it comes to the symbolism of being clothed with garments. And this verse that I'm referring to in Surah 22 verses 23 says, indeed, Allah will admit those who believe and do righteous deeds to gardens beneath which rivers flow. They will be adorned therein with bracelets of gold and pearl, and their garments therein will be silk.